This is an introduction to a series of recordings I'm going to do, including stories that myself and my sibs heard our whole life about our parents and their families. So we'll see what happens. A friend of our dad's, a guy that had been his friend before he went in the military, and then they did some things together after he was out of the military, and we moved back to the Glenwood Springs area. Told me a story about when they were young men together, and they were out riding one day, and our dad, who liked to rope things, obviously, they happened to come upon a 2-point buck, so our dad had nothing to do but rope that buck, and unfortunately, the deer doesn't act the same when you rope them as a cow does. A cow hits the end of that line and tries to break away, keeps pulling away. Deer didn't do that. The deer hit the end of that rope and came right back up that rope at him and started running around. And my dad's horse was spinning around. Before long, that rope was wrapped around the horse and around my dad's legs, and things were getting dicey. And somehow this friend of our dad's named Donnie Gates said he was able to get in there and get that rope cut. But that was just one of the foolish things that young men do. This is a story about my dad killing a badger while we were camped at Boulder Creek. One morning, fairly early, when my brother Grant and my dad were leaving camp, and I was playing lazy and laying in the cook tent where our Grant and my cots were, and Mom was in there. Anyway, Grant and our dad came upon this badger and out in the open, and my dad, who always liked to play around roping, actually roped this badger before he could get into his hole. But then the badger with the rope on him got into his hole. And I'll have my brother Grant edit this and see how accurate my story is. But apparently, even with that rope attached to the badger and my dad's horse, he couldn't pull that badger out of that hole. And so he ended up getting his .22 pistol out. And I guess you could see that badger because he shot him. He shot him several times with that .22, till finally the horse could drag him out of there and he was dead. And so that wasn't the end of the story. Then what they had to do is my dad had to drag that horseback, drag that badger down the trail to where the camp was, and then sling it into the cook tent where our mother was, just to scare her. And she was scared for a minute, and then mad for probably the rest of the day. My mom told me this story. She said when her and our dad were dating, they were back in New Jersey. She wasn't just dating him, and she had a dinner date with another gentleman, and during the meal, the other gentleman, I'll call him Ralph, decided to get up and go to the men's room, and Ralph had been gone a while, and here comes my dad, and sits down at the table. And Mom says, "What happened to Ralph?" And our dad said, "Well, he had to go home." Not all the things our dad did made our mom real happy. Once my mother and father went to meet our aunt and uncle Bud and Mary Lou at a dance, and as they got there, the dance was already started, and they walked across the dance floor. As they walked behind my uncle Bud, who was dancing at the time, my mother reached out and tipped the back of his hat, and Uncle Bud turned around and didn't see her. He saw this guy behind him, and he hauled off and smacked the guy for messing with his hat, and the guy didn't like that. He hit Bud so hard he knocked him down and slid across the floor and ended up under a table, and a big brawl broke out. And there never was any more dancing. My mother and father missed all the dancing. The rest of that story is my grandfather, my dad's dad, was apparently quoted as saying, my Uncle Bud had a college degree. Grandfather said that his family would have been better off spending all that money teaching him how to fight rather than spending all that money on a college education. When my dad and his sister Rosella were, I think, in the 6th, 8th grade, somewhere in that age group, they rode a horse to school and back. One day while in the schoolhouse, the teacher became upset with my dad and ordered him to leave. And he said, so as he got up to leave, he said, come on, to his sister Rosella, who they shared the same horse. And the teacher said, no, Rosella has to stay. You're the ones leaving. So he went and saddled up his horse and rode back over to the schoolhouse and opened the doors and rode into the schoolhouse and picked up his sister and went home. I understand when that his dad, my grandfather, found out what had happened. It didn't go well for my dad, but that's the story. My dad was finally accepted back into school there, but he told me that the rest of the school year he had to spend all the breaks or recesses or whatever they had. He had to spend all his time on his hands and knees sanding the marks that his horseshoes had made in the floor of the schoolhouse. One time after my dad had a heart attack, he was recuperating there in Cortez, and he had his horses down on some property on the edge of town, the other side of town from where we lived, and he lived, and he would have my brother Don take him down there a couple times a day to feed his horses. Had a stack of hay there, and one time Don told me this story. He said that our dad said it was off time. It wasn't the normal time to go down. He said, "Come on, Don, I think somebody's stealing my hay. Let's go down and check." So they drove down there, and sure enough, they got there, and there's some guy backed right up to the haystack with his pickup, loading the hay up. And Don says, "Here they are. Here's the old man recuperating from a heart attack, not even supposed to drive. And here's Don sitting there, an athlete playing football, whatever. And what happens? Before Don can blink, the old man's out of that truck, jumps up on a haystack, grabs that guy, throws him off on the ground, jumps on him, beats the hell out of him, and kicks him in the butt and tells him to get the hell out of there. And so the guy goes to the cops, and the cops came to see Bill, and after they explained it to him, the cops said pretty much that makes sense to them, so that's all there was to it. This is a story about my dad teaching me how to blow my nose. I was about 10 or so. I was delivering papers for the Glenwood Springs Morning Reminder, and our dad was mostly working out of town, but this one weekend he was there. It was a real snowy and blowy weekend, and the paper was larger than usual, so he got up and walked the route with me and carried some of the papers, and it was, like I said, it was pretty cold. We were crossing the bridge that crosses the Colorado River, and I was sniffling along there, and my nose was running, and he says, "Here, let me show you what to do." And he said, "Just lean over the rail here and put your finger on one side of your nose and blow real hard on the other side." And I did, and it blew it right out. And it was like, wow, that's neat. So we walked along a little while, and after a while, my dad says, "Now don't tell your mother I told you that." This story I'll call Shooting Blanks. One time, Gerald Frankini told me this story about one time my mom was out of town for some reason, and our dad called Gerald, who's one of his best buddies, and said, "Hey, Buck," called him Buck all the time. Said, "Hey, Buck, come on over, I want to show you something." So Gerald got in his pickup and drove down there, and he said he was walking up the sidewalk in front of the house, and he hears bang, bang, bang. Somebody shooting a gun inside the house. He's like, he didn't know what to do. And then the old man says, Buck, come on in here. So he went on in, and there was our dad. He did a lot of reloading, and he had reloaded some of his 38 shells, put a primer in them, and then some powder, and then put wax on top of that powder instead of a bullet. And he was sitting inside the house there, shooting those wax bullets at a cardboard box. This story is about some missing beer kegs. Back in the day when we lived in the Glenwood Springs area, at one point our dad was driving a wrecker for the Ford garage there, and in the winter they had a wreck. A beer truck went off in the Colorado River, and so they called out the wrecker to pull the truck out of the river, and somehow after that all got done, some of the beer kegs were missing, and our grandfather was at that time a deputy sheriff up there in that area, so he was assigned to try to figure out where those beer kegs went, and he got the idea that our dad had accumulated them. So for the next few days and weeks, our grandfather would show up at our house kind of unannounced, have a cup of coffee and look around, maybe open a door to a closet and look in there, and then he'd leave, and this went on for a while, and he never did find the beer kegs. But what he didn't know was our basement had a dirt floor, and my dad and a friend of his had dug a hole in the dirt and buried them beer kegs in there. So that's another example of our grandfather being on opposite sides from our father. This is a story about the Albuquerque Rodeo. When I was a young man, I had a job working for a bank down there in Albuquerque, and the bank provided us with rodeo tickets to this nice rodeo they had every fall and during the state fair in Albuquerque. So I invited our mom and dad to come down and go to that rodeo, and they did, and we went. It was a good rodeo, but along in the middle of that rodeo, there was a event happened. A cowboy came out on a bucking horse, and horse just went a couple jumps and then just kind of fell over on the ground and laid there. And of course, all the workers and everybody ran out and stood around him, and everybody, all the thousands of people in the arena there were real quiet. And after a while, they brought a big old sled out. We had a couple draft horses dragging this big old sled, and rolled that horse on that sled and drug him off out of the arena. And in the middle of that silence, that rodeo announcer says, "That's all right, folks. Sometimes them horses just sold up like that." And there's just dead silence in that arena except for one voice, our dad saying, "Bullshit. You think I don't know a dead horse when I see one? That horse is dead." Of course, our mom tried to crawl under the chair she was sitting on and hide. This story is about our new house and our new outhouse. When we moved, Mom and us kids moved back to Glenwood Springs, Canyon Creek from New Jersey. And we came out on the train, and when the train got to the depot there in Glenwood, our dad, Bill, was there waiting for us and picked us up and drove us out to the place he had for us to live. The owner of the ranch he was working at had provided this house for us. So on the way out there, my dad and Mom were teasing, and he had a surprise for her, and she was guessing, trying to figure out what the surprise was, and she had somehow figured out through the hints he gave her that she had a new washer and dryer waiting for her at this house. And lo and behold, when we got there, got out of the car, my dad said, "There it is." And the surprise was we didn't have an old outhouse, we had a new outhouse. And there wasn't plumbing or sewer or whatever in that house, so you couldn't have a washer and dryer. So anyway, that was an example of his kind of what he thought was a neat surprise, and her idea of what a neat surprise was. A few years before our dad died, he was cowboying over for an outfit called Red Ranches over in Utah, and he used to hire young men, young boys, to help him work over there in the summers. It just so happened that his sister, our Aunt Mary Lou, had just married a guy named Bill Veach over here in Cortez, and in doing so, Bill's son Warren became my aunt's stepson. Anyway, she asked my dad if he would hire Warren to work with him over there on the ranch, and so he did. And I spent some time over there, and after a few weeks, he came back for the weekend to Cortez, and my aunt asked him, Warren, how'd things go over there? And he said, that old man's mean. And she said, what do you mean mean? And she said, and Warren said, he kicked my butt. And she said, what do you mean? He beat you up? He says, no, he kicked me in the butt. Well, as it turns out, that was one of our dad's favorite ways of getting our attention when we were growing up. He would actually grab us by the scruff of the neck and kick us in the butt, kind of sideways. The side of his boot would kind of lift us up in the air. Didn't hurt much, but it sure embarrassed us. Anyway, we call it sidewinding.